Hello, Elena. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you doing?
Very good.
Hi, Dr. White. How are you?
Good. How are you doing? Good to connect with you.
It's good to connect with you too. I'm so excited. We've got people in the waiting room, but our moderator's just running a little bit late, so that's who we're waiting on right now.
Oh, sure. No worries. Thanks for letting me know.
So excited about this. We'll see. And I'm recording. We always record our Oceti Shakowi Caucus meetings. Um, so awesome. I'm kind of new to hosting, so forgive me for. Let me see here. The moderator's still not on yet.
Shante?
Chante is meeting with the Pennington Dems. I think they're having
Oh,
elections tonight, so
okay.
she won't be on. So Ramey's going to be moderating and running the meeting.
Oh, so he's still eating dinner. Great.
Procrastinated so long, and now we're running behind. So he's not even in the waiting room. I don't see. Should I yell at him from here? Ramey's my husband, by the way, Dr. White. I don't know if you haven't met Ramey, but Ramey Bald Eagle he steps in for us when our caucus president's not at our meeting. So yeah. Oh, you know what? I didn't get it in your bio, your tribe, where you're enrolled at.
Yes, we're called Citizen Potawatomi Nation.
Okay. Let me send that to him.
Where is that from, Dr. Kyle?
Well, our reservation or our nation is in Oklahoma, and so
Oh,
we're a little bit outside of Oklahoma City. I mean, it used to be kind of like not close to Oklahoma City, but now it seems pretty close with the growth of the city. But yeah, but we're like most of the tribes down that way. We're actually from up here in Michigan and northern Indiana originally.
oh, okay.
He's saying he's having a hard time getting in the meeting. Let me resend it to him really quick. Excuse me, I'll be right back.
So was your tribe relocated forcibly from
Yeah,
that area?
yeah, we it's called the Trail of Death.
Okay.
Yeah, and we went but we have about 30,000 members, and we're related to, there's a lot of other Potawatomi tribes, and we're part of the Anishinaabe, so like we're real closely related, basically same language with like Ojibwe and Odawa, so kind of getting a little bit closer to your area, but not that not that close. Like Turtle Mountain. We're related to them, though kind of on other sides of the spectrum. But
Okay.
yeah, like Chippewa. Um, but anyways, so yeah, that's who we are. But we
Okay.
because there's so many Potawatomi tribes, we maintained contact, and so I mean, there's a difference, but we still work together. So that's why I
Awesome.
live in our homelands and work with Potawatomi folks here in Michigan and Wisconsin and
Okay.
Ontario.
Excellent. So does the reservation actually cross the international border up into Canada?
We do have some that do.
Okay.
Walpole, yeah, one is called Bacajwanong Territory or Walpole Island. There's a couple as well up in the area called Sault Ste. Marie, which is where a bunch of the lakes meet right there on
Yeah.
the border.
Yeah. Excellent.
Okay, so Ramey's here now.
Oh, hi, nice to meet you. Thanks for moderating.
You're on mute.
You're muted.
Yeah, that's how my meeting's going so far. I had the wrong Zoom link, apparently. So it's a hello, Dr. Jarding, Dr. Whyte, JP, Victoria, everybody. It's Sue and Dennis. It's good to see everybody here tonight. I know I apologize for coming in at 5:05. So, but I will be happy to kick this meeting off. This meeting is being recorded for other members of the Oceti Sakowin if they want to watch it later. So I'm gonna say a quick prayer, as is our way to begin our meeting. So, how to kashla we toni mitrawa ki empetu wanji akemiku hi on wopila ichichie michante ki ichia taha hey tu kashla empetu ki le michante ki mi chuyuska he che tohali ni toka wayasu kia wahanajiki imaya chukta how mataka listen. Okay, thank you for that brief prayer, and I will kick off our weekly series of talking with individuals here on Oceti Sakowin Caucus, and I'd like to thank everybody for being on here. I'd like to in particular thank my wonderful wife Elena for being the one to organize all of this, to make sure I'm here, even though I don't listen to her and run 5 minutes late. But I, through all the stress she's dealing with me, um, and I really appreciate that. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce a citizen of the Potawatomi nation. Did I say that right, sir?
You said it right, but actually our name is Citizen Potawatomi Nation.
Okay, very good.
So I'm a citizen of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation.
Oh, you're a double citizen, and then you count United States in there. You're triple. You got the triple crown of citizenship going on here tonight. So not only is Dr. Kyle Whyte a citizen of the United States, but a citizen of the citizen of Potawatomi Nation. And he is is George Willis Pack Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. He's teaching in the Environmental Justice Specialization. Dr. Whyte is involved with a number of organizations that advance Indigenous research and education methodologies, including the Climate and Traditional Knowledges Work Group, the Sustainable Development Institute of the College of Menominee Nation, and the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. Dr. Whyte serves on the management committee of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition and the board of directors of the Pesticide Action Network North America. Recently, Dr. Whyte was named to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And it is truly an honor to have you here with us tonight, sir. And if I will, what I'll do is I'll give you the floor, and if I missed anything, I apologize, and feel free to fill in any of the spaces I left, or if you need to update what I said. But if you could basically go over some of those boards that you're on, and we're really interested in hearing about your work on the Environmental Justice Advisory Council. As you know, here in South Dakota, we've been at the forefront of environmental justice at Standing Rock for the Dakota Access Pipeline. We've been very busy fighting against the Keystone XL pipeline, as well as the work that Dr. Jarding in particular is doing in the Black Hills to do our best to safeguard it against uranium mining and preserve the important waterways and watersheds in our sacred Black Hills. So this is not about me, it's about you. So I'll let you get started and welcome.
Bonjour, Bimam. Kami garan Deshnakas, Potawatomi and Dow, Shishibaniak, Dabindagwes, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Doshbia. Hey, everybody. So I'm Kyle, and I wanted to thank Elena and Remy, and especially Elena for organizing this and get in touch with me. I'm really excited to have the chance to share with you all. I know some of you all live and some of you all through the recording. So shout out to those who might be checking out the recording. I first wanted to just give a word of encouragement to the work that you're doing with the caucus. In Michigan, we just recently, last couple of years, founded a Anishinaabe caucus, and my tribe is within the Anishinaabe group. Anishinaabe are the main native folks in Michigan, and I'm a participant in the caucus and a supporter of it, but we have some real amazing hardcore organizers like Andrea Pierce, who really is one of the people that has put in tremendous effort in the caucus in the Democratic Party. And I really just respect the work that they've done, because in Michigan, during the presidential election 4 years ago, it was only about a 10,000 vote margin. And I think folks like Andrea, who is also somebody that fought against Enbridge Line 5, which is a pipeline repair project that goes through a sacred area for Anishinaabe people. I think people like Andrea and many others were like, well, this is unacceptable. We can't have elections where, we can't advocate for issues because of 10,000 votes. And, they really got to work organizing. And another organization that I'm one of the founding members of, and currently the board chair of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, we got busy as well with voting issues and with trying to change the direction of the issues in the energy in Michigan. And as you probably saw, right, Michigan being a swing state, this time there was a difference in the opposite direction, and it was by over 50,000 votes, I believe. And that vote came from Native people. It came from people of color. And it came from, groups. I mean, Native people in Michigan, we're not a big percentage of the state, we're not, but that organizing had a huge impact. And it's also encouraged a bunch of younger folks too. And younger folks are excited about doing this work because they see that it makes a difference. So, I was really excited to hear from you all. And I have a good sense of what you're up to and, the hard work and, and the achievements that you're having there in that state context. And so, I wanted to just follow up on that with some of the information about the work that I do. And I appreciate the prompts from Remy. And, you all can feel free to, at any point, raise your hand or just interrupt if you have questions. I'm going to cover a number of topics which I think are relevant for the work you're doing in support of the platforms and the issues that are meaningful to the people and the communities that matter to you. And I'm also going to put a couple of links in the chat here for stuff I might cover. So don't worry, I'm not looking the other direction to check my Twitter account or to look on Facebook, or if you hear me typing, I'm just pulling up some of the links. But the first thing I wanted to mention is, my tribe, were called the Citizen Potawatomi Nation because back in the 19th century, we were first forcibly relocated to Kansas. and I know some of you know this history, but a lot of tribes that are in Oklahoma, they were first forced into Kansas, and that's where they thought they were going to be. They were going to stay. But then we were threatened by the railroad coming in, and we kind of had a debate within our tribe. There were some of our ancestors thought that we needed our own private property held by individuals. This is before allotment, right? We need our own private property to be able to defend ourselves against land dispossession. And then we had another set of ancestors that they felt we needed communal property, land held in common, which was obviously the system that we had historically. And so actually we settled the debate by sort of parting ways. There's the group that wanted communal property. They stayed in Kansas, and they're a group that some of you know called the Prairie Band Potawatomi. And they're amazing people and doing amazing things. My ancestors, we went to Oklahoma and we struck a deal with the US that we could take private property, but we also had to become US citizens. And so when we became US citizens, that's what we became called, was we were the Citizen Potawatomi. So Citizen Potawatomi, or we used to be called Citizen Band Potawatomi, and the Prairie Band Potawatomi. And so we then took an area of land in Oklahoma, and we're down with a number of other tribes who are originally from the Great Lakes like us, like the Sac and Fox and Kickapoo and Shawnee. And so anyways, that's our history, and that's where we actually got that sort of English name from. And so while we've always been federally recognized and always maintained our sovereign governance, that's been unbroken. We were actually US citizens at a time when there weren't that many other tribes that were that were US citizens then. So it's a unique history. And yeah, so to move on in terms of the work that I do, there are a lot of Potawatomi tribes in Michigan. So Michigan has about 4 Potawatomi tribes. There are about 4 or 5, depending on how you count, Potawatomi tribes that are on the Ontario side. And then there's a Potawatomi tribe called Forest County Potawatomi that's in Wisconsin, as well as I mentioned earlier, the Prairie Band. And we're actually really closely related to the Ojibwe, to Odawa people. And so we're all Anishinaabe. We all refer to ourselves as Anishinaabe people. And actually our furthest, I think, west, relatives, I think there's some others too, but one that comes to mind is Turtle Mountain, Chippewa, Ojibwe, they're Anishinaabe as well. And so they speak a similar language and similar stories and backgrounds. We're a really big community. And when I moved to Michigan, to our homeland, one of the things that was most important to me was actually protecting our native species and the plants that really matter to us, the fish, the animals that really matter to us. And, for me, being somebody who's from a tribe in Oklahoma, being back in Michigan or Wisconsin or Ontario, I mean, that's like the homeland, right? And, I was really excited about what tribes were doing in the area to protect, sturgeon, to, protect medicinal plants. But I felt that right about the time that I got there, that there were these forecasts that the climate was changing. And one of the things that, I don't know if you've seen the book by Robin Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass, but Robin, who's also a member of my tribe, she had conveyed to me something that the Environmental Protection Agency had put out, which actually showed that in 50 years, the climate in Michigan was going to be actually like the climate in Oklahoma right now. And so I remember having that kind of thing about, wow, they just they are doing anything to get us all into Oklahoma, even if that means it's through the climate system moving that far north. And so, in Michigan right now, it can be very challenging, right? When there's less, winter days, you get rain when you don't want it, right? Right now we have a drought, and you don't get rain when you really do want rain. And so our climate system is destabilizing, and we're nowhere near the dire situation with regard to rapid change in temperature and precipitation and winter than a lot of native folks are in Alaska, in the Arctic. And in the work that I do, when I started thinking, well, why are these changes occurring? And I looked to a lot of sources in the science that said it was because the burning of fossil fuels is increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that creates a warming effect. And so basically, it's the industrial economy, right? It's the industrial energy sources that are causing these changes in the environment that are really hitting a lot of communities hard. It's making some communities have to change their culture. It's affecting their economy, such as their tourism industry, their fishing economy, their farming and agricultural economy. It's even affecting things that we don't always think about that much, right? I remember that when I was working with some tribes in the Great Lakes on doing scenario planning for climate change, and we were talking about the fact that the snowpack is changing. And a couple of folks said, well, one of the things that's challenging about that is that when you don't have as good of a snowpack, it's harder to see the tracks of the animals. So obviously, right? But what they said is that makes it harder to get children excited about doing stuff out on the land, because if you're teaching them how to go hunting, they're not going to be as successful without being able to track the animals as well. And so if you take them outside and it's cold and all of that, and they're not as successful as they normally would be, that's going to be really discouraging, and they might prefer to be doing something else, right, that's not out on the land. And so there's a lot of impacts like that we don't always think about, but that for a lot of Native folks, that's exactly what they're facing, and the rest of society doesn't really recognize that. But then on the other side of the spectrum, Native people in the US context are some of the first people that are actually having to permanently resettle due to climate change. I served as a Native American advisor for the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe and the United Homa Nation, Louisiana, and they have members that live on a very tiny island right on the coast. They're having to permanently resettle. And in that case, right, historically, if you look at the evidence anywhere in the world, that most of the time, if a community has to resettle, and I don't mean due to climate change, but just resettle for any reason, it creates further risks, further impoverishment, further economic challenges. And so the fact that Native people are on the front lines of resettlement, and it's not just Louisiana, it's the Arctic, it's the Northeast, it's some communities in Maine, and potentially other parts of the United States too, like Washington State and the Puget Sound area, it presents a huge risk. And so when we think about climate change and what it means to us, it affects our cultures, it affects our ways of life, not just what we're currently doing, but also the ones we aspire to, right? Many of us are trying to recover those traditions that mattered to our ancestors, but it also has very real consequences for our economies, our contemporary economies, whether they're traditional economies or not. And it has an effect on our sovereignty. For example, in the Pacific Northwest or in the Great Lakes region, we have treaties that have very strong hunting, fishing, gathering rights in areas that are off reservation. And if a community is having to change where it harvests a particular animal that's culturally or economically sacred, and they have to do so on land that the non-Native population doesn't recognize as land that Native people should be doing things on, then it creates a political issue. And you have to engage at a political level with treaty rights. And while it's true that our treaty rights are at the statutory level, right, they have that level of authority, that doesn't mean that it's particularly pleasant to have to relitigate them or to renegotiate them or to take them up again. And so, in this way, climate change is something that's multidimensional and affects Native people, each tribe in a different way, but in multiple ways. And to kind of shift into some of the more political aspects of it is, one of the problems is that for Native folks, and this is something I've learned in the research I do, climate change is not really a new phenomena for us. When I talk to a lot of non-Native folks, like, wow, people just discovered that the climate could change by human causes, in the 19th century, and then they finally kind of put it together in the 60s and 70s, and this is something that humanity is not yet ready for. And I understand that point, but actually, Native folks have been documenting, going way back, changes in climate, changes in seasons that occur. And, for a lot of Native communities, it was perfectly normal for us to think about our society needing to be organized in a way that was adaptable to seasonal change happening around us. And that we were keeping track of whether years were becoming warmer or cooler, or whether the winters were changing, or whether precipitation patterns were changing. So for us, one of our oldest sciences is actually climate science. Climate science is not a new science for us, it's an old one. And this is one of the reasons why Indigenous people today are among the most active advocates of doing something about climate change. It's not just because we're affected severely and we face threats, but it's because we know that a society is well organized when it's paying attention to environmental change, when it's paying attention to climate change. So one of the reports that the United States produces to try to understand the risks of climate change is called the National Climate Assessment. And the National Climate Assessment is established by statute from the early 1990s in a statute called the U.S. Global Change Research Act. And so the US Global Change Research Act, and it actually might be from the late 80s, but I think it's from the early 90s, established that during a certain period of time, every 5 years, the US has to produce a report that synthesizes risks and highlights strategies for dealing with climate change. And I've been an author on that report before, in the 2018 report. So there's one that's going to come up in a couple of years. And I've also worked for other reports produced by what's called the USGCRP, which is the US Global Change Research Program, which is the program created out of that statute. And in a 2018 report, we have a chapter that's just devoted to tribes and Indigenous people. And it brings in all the literature, and I can send you all a copy of it. It brings in all the literature on climate change risks and climate change concerns that tribes have in every part of the world, including your part of the world. And part of what we did in the chapter, and it's the Bureau of Indian Affairs that I believe stewarded this process, is they looked into how many different actions Native people were taking to address climate change. And initially, when we published it, we found over 800 actions. And now it's well over 1,000. They've continued to update it. So well over 1,000 actions to address climate change. And by the way, those actions, in terms of how they investigated them, do not actually count a lot of the environmental justice actions. They don't account for like some of the anti-pipeline struggles and so on. So it's over 1,000, and it doesn't even count those. And if it counted those, it'd probably double or triple. And so anyways, the way I look at it is, you all know about the total population of Native people in the US context, several million, right? Give or take 3 million, 4 million. The state of Michigan has 10 million people. The state of Michigan does not have, outside of Native people, over 1,000 climate change initiatives. Nowhere close to that. So when you look at the fact that there's that many grassroots, tribally led climate change initiatives, and those are just the ones that were documented in one particular way. That, because I think one thing we learn in Indian country is, if you look at a statistic on something like that, it's like usually triple. The reality is triple or quadruple, right? Because of how much oftentimes people work directly at the community level, and they don't go around advertising widely what they're doing. They just do the action, they just do the work. And so that's how engaged Native people are in climate change. And this includes tribes that are creating climate change plans. This includes tribes that are creating educational programs on climate change. These are tribes that are working with scientific organizations, to understand better the risks and threats they're facing from climate change. These are tribes engaging in resettlement activities. And so the National Climate Assessment, going back actually to its very first report in 2001, has had a tribal chapter. And I think it's important to note that while larger bodies that deal with climate change, like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, only recently have they considered Indigenous people, tribes in the US context actually held a conference in the mid 1990s on climate change. And the information from that conference formed a chapter of the 2001 National Climate Assessment. And so we were actually involved, and obviously we, not me individually, because that was before my time, right? But Native people were involved back in the very beginning of the first way in which the US began to publicly assess climate change risks. And one of the things that you see in these reports, and that differs from the non-tribal aspects, is that the tribal aspects are very, very clear that the reason why Native people are susceptible to climate change is actually not because we just rely on natural resources or we happen to live randomly in places that are affected by climate change. It actually has to do with colonialism and our current situation. For example, according to the science of resilience, something like being shrunk by millions of acres or thousands of acres into a small reservation area, having a treaty that is not honored and not having capacity to be sovereign in the actual treaty area, having reservation area that was allotted and checkerboarded, and so that the tribe might only control a few acres, those make it hard to adapt. Those make it so maybe the places where you have the most capacity to engage in commercial practices or traditional practices, those are kind of your only options. And there's not a lot of capacity to move around. The United States is able to do things all over North America, and many of our ancestors kind of did that too, though they did it in ways that were a lot more respectful of each other. But when you have a larger area and you have a larger area of land that and you have better relationships with people around you, you can adapt to change. And so when people look at a case like the resettlement at the Ile de Jean Charles, do you really think that those tribes chose a tiny island as their one place of personal, permanent residence? Of course not. They lived in a much bigger area. And for years, those indigenous people have been pointing out that their land had been dispossessed repeatedly. It had been polluted by petrochemical industries. They'd been cut out of infrastructure planning in the area. They'd been racially discriminated against. They'd been marginalized within the school system. They have a backlog of concerns about how their territory has been shrunk and shrunk and shrunk to the point where the area where many of their members live and engage in a mixed lifestyle, including some of their traditional subsistence practices, now that area is threatened by coastal erosion. And why are we in the position that coastal erosion is as extreme and moving as quick as it is? Because of the industrial economy that increased the emissions of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And how is it possible for that industrial economy to get that big in the first place? Well, because they needed to dispossess us of our land and marginalize us from our land to be able to let those industries take root. And so for this reason, we need to understand that for us, climate change is not just a matter of economic solutions that will appease us and ameliorate the impacts that we're facing. A huge part of dealing with climate change is to restore and recover our sovereignty, our treaty rights. And so I think it's important to note that from a standpoint of advocacy, even from the standpoint of legislation, something like tribal consultation and the strengthening and improvement of consultation can take us a long way, right? The restoration of treaty rights can take us a long way. The advocacy for Indigenous educational institutions, for greater funding for tribal colleges and universities, not just for teaching, but for research, for graduate programs. These are all things that strengthen our capacity to respond to climate change and to continue the leadership that we're taking to address climate change. And so what I think is really important to understand is that we really can't get distracted by some of the mainstream discourse on what climate change is. Oh, I see you have a hand up, Remy.
Thank you. So I didn't. When you were talking about climate change, you hit on a very sensitive subject for us here in South Dakota, and that is tribal consultation. A lot of times, to everybody else in the world, tribal consultation means that they have a little checkbox,
Yep.
talking to somebody in the tribe, and it don't matter what tribe, as long as they do it, and then they check the little box, and that's it. They don't. There's no consent. There's no honest exchange of ideas in tribal consultation. And if we wish to have a true nation government, which is how our treaties and how our governments are set up, then those consultations should be with all the decision makers at the table, and not those that can't make the decisions at the table. Especially at the decision, when it comes time to make that decision. I can understand exchanging ideas and then coming back for consultation later, because one of the problems is that tribal nations don't always have the subject matter experts to deal with a lot of the issues that federal agencies or commercial businesses present to tribes regarding environmental. And I think when we talk in terms of environmental justice, I think environmental justice to us means treating our planet, treating our land as if it is one of us, and giving it the same rights and to live and to be productive and be there for us as we have for each other. And so I think you hit on a key point, especially here in South Dakota, where we have 9 large land-based tribes. And what's even more interesting is that we have a large treaty area. So we have an unceded treaty area that encompasses all of Western South Dakota, most of Wyoming, Montana, some parts of Nebraska, this huge area. And so so here's my question. I know I get a long-winded here, but here's a question. Would it not serve the federal government at this time to work with tribes and consider honest consent-based consultation as a viable mechanism for protecting our environment, as a viable mechanism for helping dictate which direction climate change is going to go in? So thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Remy, for your question points. And just to remind you that my glancing to the side was because I was pulling up the links while I was listening to you. So I appreciate your bearing with me on it. So you've opened up a topic that I really would like to focus on in more detail. And one of the links I posted, if it works, it's the Dropbox one, is an article I recently published with some colleagues on the legal aspects of consultation in a way that reflects consent. And I'd like to, so to begin with, your point about consultation reflecting consent is a critical one, and it's one that's very close to my heart, because when I was looking at most environmental justice issues, and so I'd like to shift a little bit just from environmental justice in terms of climate change to environmental justice, one of the things that you see is that environmental injustice is made possible, whether it's a pipeline, whether it's a uranium mine, whether it's a resettlement for climate change. Environmental injustice festers when there's no genuine consultation. And one of the experiences I had, I remember I went to Canada once when Canada had created it had revised its consultation policy. And I was going to speak in Ontario to a largely government audience there and First Nations audience to just speak comparatively to the US consultation policy. And so there are a bunch of speakers there, like 5 or 6, and we were in kind of a green room. And somebody from the Crown, right, as they call it there, so from the Crown came in to kind of prep us. And, which is normal in a policy context, so you don't kind of accidentally say something irrelevant. But one of the things that they said, right, was they said, just remember, the consultation is not a veto power. Just make sure you don't refer to it as a veto power. And so I remember in that event, one of the other kind of native scholars that says, okay, that's fine, but let's just call the Canadian consultation policy what it is. It's an infringement policy. It's just infringement, right? Because it says if you have a certain consultative activity, there's no decision-making influence in it. You have it, and then the proponent, the company, and the agencies doing the permitting, they just do what they originally set out to do, and there's no way to influence the situation. And so what we're seeing right now, and National Congress of American Indians has produced recommendations on consultation, and actually one of the most effective executive orders is the 13175, which is the Tribal Consultation Executive Order. But it hasn't gotten, Remy, to the point that you're talking about, which is where I want to get with it, is that consultation as practiced is a consent process. But to be a consent process, and I'm going to share some of the current policy happenings that are related to this, to be a consent process, it not only has to have that veto power and that consensuality to it, but there has to be the capacity associated with it. But the issue with capacity is that for a lot of tribes, and I don't know in your part of the world if it also plays out in this way too, but I know in my part of the world certainly does. If you say that we don't have the capacity to engage in consultation, then the US will say, well, you're not really sovereign then, right? And so you have to be, well, not you, but I mean, we have to be strategic, right, in terms of how we talk about the needs of consultation, because it can often be interpreted in a deficit mode. And I've run into this problem myself. And so one of the things I've been trying to do is exactly what you're arguing for, which is to talk about the fact that we need to have our own experts. They need to be paid. We need to have access to people we trust. The actual agencies themselves need to really invest in real permanent staff. I remember in Michigan, I went to a quarterly meeting for the tribal environmental professionals, and there was a new liaison by the state, and the person came in to introduce themselves and said, you know what, I was about to retire, and the governor pulled me right back in and said, one more thing for you to do, and you're the tribal liaison now. That doesn't, to me, sound like a career opportunity. And this is the issue, right? For consultation to work, there actually have to be agency staff that are there permanently. It's a career opportunity for them. It's real diplomacy, right? We need to have our support and resources to engage our experts. They need to be empowered. And the federal government and the state governments need to care too. Maybe let me get to your point, Remy. I saw your hands up again.
Yeah, I know this is a discussion I think you and I can go around and around and have great contributions to each other's conversation. And those are great points, and I think I'd like to point out that the federal government, not the Queen's government, but the federal government, they have treaties with multiple different tribes, and each one of those treaties have dictate different ways that they interact with each other. So having a one, there's no silver bullet that's going to solve consultation for every tribe. But going back to your point on subject matter experts, I think it's crucial that for the Sioux tribes in South Dakota in particular, that the federal government has a trust responsibility to look out for the best interest of not just the individual Indians, but the tribal governments as well. And so there needs to be some level of support from that agency in their trust responsibility to provide those subject matter experts to the tribe in a manner that produces trust and confidence in those advisors, if you will, that they should be providing. Because it's easy for them to come in and say, well, let's consult on the Higgs-Boson effect, and the tribal council is going to be looking around like this. But if a scientist comes in and says, I'm here to explain it all to you. Tribes would be a lot more comfortable with consultation in that regard. And then, so I'm really key with you on that. But the other portion of the consultation book is it seems consultation has burned tribes in the past.
Yeah.
And you know, the corporation or oftentimes the federal government will third party consultation to a private company, and that company, the only thing they're looking for in consultation is what tribes may sue them on. And then they take that away from the consultation, saying we're going to change what we're doing only to take away what tribes can take us to court over. And not necessarily, and that's if they believe that the tribe has the ability to do that. So I think consultation in the past has really burned a lot of tribes, and so a lot of tribes are hesitant to even commit to consultation. And in most cases, I know I've personally been to consultations where tribes have ghosted those consultation proceedings because you know, one, the subject is they don't have a subject matter expert on, and two, they're afraid of making a commitment to their government or future generations over something that they didn't get enough support on in the first place. So speaking to what you're saying, I think it speaks volumes for the consultation process.
Yeah, absolutely. And Remy, those are amazing points. And I have to control a bit the information I provide, because you're right. It's a topic I've been in the space on for so long that there's so many angles on it. And so here's what I'd like to follow up on, you know, relevant to some of the policy updates that I wanted to give you that are also related to legislation, is that consultation, in exactly the way you've been articulating it, Remy, it's become even more urgent and concerning, because right now there's been a transition that's taken place in environmental justice policy. So when the Biden administration, you know, really took stock and recognized the fact that it was Native people, it was people of color, it was other groups that experienced discrimination who turned the election out for the Democrats, that played that big role. One of the ways the administration approached it was to really attempt to honor those people, right? Those communities, those people that put forth such tremendous effort. And the infrastructure legislation and the executive plans for infrastructure, which is in the multi-billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars. So at the executive branch level, which is where I'm most involved in, and I do also do some legislative branch work, but at the executive level, at the White House, they have an initiative called Justice 40. And the Justice 40 initiative, and the last link I sent is, it's about a 90-page document of recommendations that the Environmental Justice Council I'm on produced over the last 6 weeks, and a huge chunk of it's on Justice 40. So Justice 40 says that, and this is an executive order 14008, which is called Tackling the Climate Crisis, but it's actually an executive order that transforms environmental justice policy. It creates a new White House Council on Environmental Justice and a new White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council made up of the heads of the federal agencies. And the Justice 40 initiative says, if you look at the infrastructure investments in some major areas, renewable energy, resilient infrastructure, clean water infrastructure, and this is what it says word for word, 40% of the benefits of those investments, of those federal investments, must be to communities affected by environmental justice, of which tribes are obviously within that community, are recognized as within that category. And what does 40% of the benefits mean? What does that mean? And what the attention on infrastructure has begun to mean is that right now, environmental justice and infrastructure is the largest force driving environmentalism. because it's through these investments that renewable energy, climate change solutions, and so on are being delivered. But what does it mean actually, for example, to just create renewable energy or to create resilient infrastructure in tribes? What does that mean? A lot of tribes, the electrification grid never fully reached them. The roads are inadequate. There's not adequate telecommunications or broadband, right? There's a backlog of environmental inequity that's created a current infrastructure situation. And so the National Congress of American Indians in 2017 produced an infrastructure report. And then they recently updated that in April with an infrastructure letter that updated that report, which I can send you the letter. And according to their figures, Indian country has an over $50 billion backlog in infrastructure divestment. Now, you can't build a renewable energy, microgrid if you haven't first addressed roads, broadband, telecommunication, water, right? But who knows this? Well, tribes know this, but do other people outside of tribes understand this? And they don't. And so right now is an overwhelming time because we're trying to capitalize on hundreds of billions of dollars. The administration is seeking to do so in a way that will resonate prior to the midterm elections. But without a strong consultation policy, will that money be dispensed in a way that actually makes improvements for tribes? And the consultation part is the key. How will tribal leadership be involved? How will tribal experts be involved? And will the infrastructure actually be direct investment, meaning that tribes would actually end up with the financial institutions? They would end up controlling and owning the infrastructure. They would be able to both use the energy infrastructure for their own energy uses, but also be key in selling energy to others. That's what needs to happen, but it can only be coordinated if the consultation policy is deep, rich, and consensual. And in the recommendations that I just linked to, you'll see that one of the contributions that I made was to emphasize as much as possible the consultation standards and policies and the importance of consultation. But Remy, like you were saying, it's not just about the current standards of consultation, but also about where consultation needs to go, and to reckon with the fact that so many tribes have been burned by consultation in the past that it's very hard to persuade some tribes that it's anything but a sort of a puppet exercise. And so my idea, and thinking about this from a electoral standpoint, from a political advocacy standpoint, and I don't necessarily have the answer to this myself, but there has to be some way to hold politicians and others accountable for their views on consultation and for the actions that they take or don't take that affect consultation, both the exercise of consultation, but also strengthening the policy. Most Americans, and you all referenced, the Standing Rock tribes struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline. A lot of the legal issues in it, I've looked at them in great detail, and it's disgusting how the consultative process was botched in that case. And that wasn't the only problem, of course, right? I've worked before with groups like Earth Justice and others and seen how they've worked. And a lot of what they do is they find where the consultation was botched. And the Bay Mills tribe, which is a federally recognized tribe in Michigan, they were so frustrated with the fact that there were over 10 agencies at the state and federal level that were dealing with different aspects of the permitting for the Enbridge Line 5 pipeline, which is going to be replaced in the Mackinac Straits, which again is a sacred area for Anishinaabe people, an important area for Anishinaabe people. The Bay Mills tribe got so frustrated, and their current president, Brian Newland, who's now Assistant Deputy Secretary of Indian Affairs and Interior, he got so frustrated because all the agencies would say, well, we're not responsible for that permit. The tribe would ask for consultation, And the agencies, well, we're not, that's this other agency. You contact that agency, we'll talk to them. Oh, no, that's the state, or oh, that's the Fed. And so the Bay Mills tribe got so frustrated that they held their own consultation, and I think it was about 15 agencies showed up. And the Bay Mills tribe, and this is a great example of what you were talking about, Remy, they contacted me and some other folks and said, can you all put together scientific presentations that speak to risks, legal issues, environmental issues tied to the pipeline? And we practiced that repeatedly. It was like 10 different people that presented. We had a short period of time to convey to the agencies, and we were all selected because the tribe trusted us. We had a track record of delivering. And so we put together the most tightly scripted thing ever. That thing was right on time. It was crisp. It was great. And then we end, and it's opened up for the agencies to respond, and they were so disorganized. I mean, they weren't sharing information properly. They didn't know who said what, everybody was trying to get out of the way and let some other agency, the Army Corps of Engineers, I think, called in while they were driving, and you could hear the car, what kind of nation to nation consultation is that? And so, the Bay Mills tribe had that, and a few days later, actually, the governor of Michigan halted the pipeline project. And, we're not out of the woods yet, but, the consultation did matter. And I think in the future, it'll have more important implications to it. This was just in October. And so my point being, right, is that, a true nation and nation relationship is one where not only does the United States take its consultative duties seriously in a real way, including staffing people who have career opportunities to make consultation meaningful, right? There's, similar to the diplomats they have for other countries. Look at how much the US invests in diplomats. What are diplomats? They're people that manage consultative processes with France and with Thailand. Why don't we have the equivalent or analogous for tribal nations? Imagine the difference it would make. Yeah, go ahead, Remy.
Yeah. Well, I guess to be clear, I should have led with the fact that I work as the intergovernmental affairs coordinator for the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and we had fought Dakota Access Pipeline.
Right. Yeah.
KXL and the current administration lived up to their promise and stopped the KXL pipeline, and we couldn't be more ecstatic for that nod to how important that is, not just to the administration, but it is to us, because for the first time we felt, and for the first time since I've worked for my tribe, we felt that there was an honest government to government nod towards each other mutually, and so that was supremely important. And I think I've always said that I think one of the biggest problems is that consultation is given to the agency or the corporation, and it is not done in a government to government manner as it would with any other government in the world. And we forget that the treaties aren't Indian treaties.
Right.
They're American treaties. They're United States treaties. And so you bring up a really great point on all of that. And I didn't want to hijack the environmental justice conversation with just the consultation process. But, that is one of the key pieces to environmental justice from a tribal government perspective. And you're right, when we were consulted by the company that did Dakota Access Pipeline, I'm not going to get too into that, but they counted every email they sent to us as a consultation, and so when they noted hundreds of times they consulted with us, and it just I won't go there anymore, but in out of respect for your time, we're coming close to 6 o'clock here, but I'd really like to get some questions from some of our audience members about their questions to you from an environmental justice perspective.
Sure. And hey, I definitely have time. So if you all have time, I have time. So
Well, that's perfect because I could talk to you all night about this. But I'm going to hand off real quick to anybody, Victoria or Dennis. Do any of you have any questions at this time? Okay, that's fine. Um, but so I'd really like to get a lot of that information that you're talking about. I'm extremely intrigued in this particular issue, and I'm certainly thankful for you coming on tonight and talking about this. You've given us quite a good insight as to policies at the that the current administration is working on. It gives me a good idea because a lot of times we don't, we may see the results um of that of those policies, but we don't oftentimes see the direction that the head is looking. And so you telling us these things gives us a better idea of the advice that's being given. So I'm gonna grab a charger for my laptop, and I'm gonna let my wife take over from here. She has a question.
Thank you. Well, I've got several questions. What do you, let me see. I had a lot of questions that you went over already, but what do you think was some of the detrimental things that happened in the past, the previous administration, as far as environmental justice and just the whole colonial settler stuff that's happening with the environment?
Great, and thanks for your question, Elena. So we didn't actually get a chance to see what the previous administration truly had up its sleeve, because one of the things that so one of the things that happens, in different environmental justice situations is that, typically state governments, and this is borne out through experiences from Native people, from other communities too. But state governments have generally not been very supportive of environmental equity issues. States are wanting to permit these industries, and it's related to the state's economy. And and states don't recognize tribal sovereignty automatically, because many states, tribal sovereignty is not in their constitution, and not that the U.S. Constitution has amazing statements of tribal sovereignty, but we are nonetheless in the Commerce Clause and are referenced in the Constitution. And so one of the things that happens in a lot of environmental justice cases, and again, I know I'm speaking to colleagues here that are familiar with these types of situations, is that, when a state controls a permitting process, they very quickly roll over on behalf of the proponents of the companies. But often the federal government has worked with tribes or others to halt or put a wrench into some of those plans, right? So oftentimes the federal agencies, through their own rules or just the perspective of the officials that, and I'm certainly not speaking here of the Army Corps of Engineers, but I mean agencies like EPA and others, I can think of a lot of cases, right, where their relationship with tribes and their understanding of the problems with the state allowed them to find ways to halt things that they could control, and that bought time, that created a more capacity for the EJ issue to be addressed. Now, what the Trump administration did last summer was they issued, so not only did they roll back across the whole administration a number of different environmental regulations, but over the summer, they had rolled back even further requirements for public participation, criteria for environmental impact assessments, but none of those things got implemented in practice because they got voted out of office. And so the scary part is that if there's a next Republican presidential administration, which I hope there is not, that they could use that playbook again, because literally the changes that they made at the end, which would have reduced consultation and public participation to zilch, they were about to get enacted. And And so basically one of the first things that the Biden administration did, and I forget the number, but Biden issued an executive order claiming all federal agencies needed to review every single Trump administration rollback and reverse it. And so that was one of the first executive orders. And so that's one of the things that's changed with the, with the new administration, is that there was a quick and swift rollback of all of those changes and potentially almost implemented changes from the Trump administration. Now, historically, in terms of environmental injustice, so there's a lot of ways to approach that question, and I'm going to approach it through a particular route, but it's not the only route. So if you look at the treaty era, right, the US stopped signing treaties, in the 1870s. But, if you look at what some of those treaties said and the land that the tribes had in those treaties, if that setup was actually honored, I wouldn't say we'd be in the greatest position, but it would be a lot better than what, would have happened. We would have retained our court systems, our policing systems, we'd have retained our educational systems. We would have been able to continue all of those institutions and traditions and grow them and create economies that were not just based on two industries or based on leasing your land, like real diversified economic portfolios. But basically, when the US stopped signing the treaties and started dealing with us through statute, that was a huge blow to consultation, diplomacy, and consent, because it meant that the US could create policies that affected us and that the US had plenary power over without our consent, because they were operating at the statutory level. They weren't operating at the treaty level. And so it's not surprising that some of the first statutes, and I know in your part of the world, this is something that hits close to home, was the allotment policy, and then was the Major Crimes Act, right? And a number of other statutes at the time. They went for our court system, our police system, they went for our land. They privatized it and then created the system that many of our ancestors suffered from, where if you were competent or incompetent as the US declared you, it didn't matter, right? If you were competent, you could get rid of your land and be swindled from it, right? If you were incompetent, then the land would be leased to a non-native person. And so the first actual blow of environmental inequity after the warfare and the problems of the treaty area was that allotment policy and the millions of acres that were lost. And so that created a situation where for tribes, you had industries that were polluting or that were cutting tribal people out of the economy right there on those reservations. And then the erosion of tribal governments made it so that industries could, and in the 19th century and early 20th century, it was individuals and small companies could just set up shop right there, right next to your community, and set up a mine or set up a transportation operation or something else, uranium, whatever it was. They could just set up shop, and there actually weren't a lot of rules then. And one of the things I note to people is, I know a lot of us have seen or dealt with the, issue of non-native people trying to fraudulently present themselves as native. And that's not a recent phenomenon. In Oklahoma in the 19th century, because of how cosmopolitan tribes were in terms of their racial backgrounds, that a lot of non-tribal people tried to pass as native people to take hold of that land and then start economic enterprises and so on, taking advantage of rights that were for tribes. And so the early era of environmental injustice is kind of this era, but what happens, right, is that the US tries to take action to ameliorate it. They try to make it better. But when they tried to make it better, they created the system that we're now familiar with today. So what happens, right, is in the 1920s, there's the Merriam Report, which was a report by the US federal government on the success of the allotment period. But it didn't say that there was a success. It said allotment was a catastrophic failure, and that it led to economic problems, bureaucratic problems, that it was a mess. And so John Collier, who took power over the Bureau at the Indian Affairs at the time, sought to change the situation and created our contemporary environmental justice situation, though he didn't intend to do that. Collier thought the tribes should be organized as corporations. And I know many tribes in your part of the world fought against this, and but those were critical efforts to do that. But he thought tribes should be corporations and that they'd be able to negotiate with corporations, non-native corporations, and to be able to strike upon better terms for mining or extractive industries or so on that would take place on tribal lands or pipelines. But what happened was that the way that Felix Cohen, Collier's lawyer, and Collier had articulated the policy, it created a situation where you had tribes reorganized as corporations for those tribes that chose to go that path early on. And then you had a whole bunch of corporations that were trying to get in on those lands, but then there was no sufficient layer of BIA oversight or accountability to make sure that each of those companies had the right safety standards, created contracts that were economically fair for tribes. And so because the government wasn't given the capacity to do that, the corporations overwhelmed with permit applications. And that's where we get this era of companies providing information, scientific information on their own permits. Why isn't the government doing that? Why isn't the federal government doing that? Well, they don't have the capacity to do it. So it devolved to companies, which is why you see these situations like, Remy, that you described, where it's like some third party, or I was involved in an EJ issue in Michigan where an archaeological assessment was done by a company from England. Like, what do they know about Anishinaabe cultural heritage? Not a doggone thing. And so it created this system, right, where tribes had no control over information and science. And it created these things that we now know are serious cases of inequity, like Navajo workers in uranium mines not being informed of the health risks when they were well known to scientists outside of the Navajo Nation. It created a situation where in the oil industry, tribes were signing contracts with oil companies brokered by the Bureau of Indian Affairs that actually had clauses in them that were never applied to any other community, like clauses that if the value of oil changed, you still had to stick to the original terms of the contract. There was no, I forget the legal term for it, but it's a contractual term. And it created this awful situation. And so that's why you see tribes like in the 70s with the energy resource tribes trying to take control of that situation. And I know that the Council on Energy Resource Tribes is not one that's popular for a lot of reasons. I mean, it doesn't exist anymore, but it nonetheless is an example of tribes seeking to take control of their own environmental jurisdiction. And so, go ahead, Remy.
I won't make this too long. 2 quick questions. How do you feel about tribes making their own permitting agencies for their jurisdictions? And is there documentation, or is there a precedent or anything of that nature for how a state government can help support tribes in tribes being permitting agencies or participating in a permitting process?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good connection that I can fold into the response I was giving to Elena. So that works out well. No, I wasn't saying it for that reason. I was just saying I can merge it in. So basically you get this situation where tribes weren't controlling, permitting processes, and because of the erosion of tribal governance, like Remy, you were saying earlier, tribes weren't exactly in the position where they could put forward their own, scientists or even one of the key things about consultation is that tribes should be able to define what safe enough means based on our cultural understandings of what matters, right? Our knowledge holders should be able to say, this is valuable or sacred. It shouldn't just be up to another culture to define that for us. And so one of the things that happens in the 70s with the Educational and Self-Determination Act is that then tribes have this policy opportunity that tribes fought for to take on the regulatory functions that states have, right? So, you have a federal program like Clean Air, Clean Water, and the federal government sets the standard, but then they want states to operate those programs at the state level, and there's incentives for states to do that. And so in the 70s, right, one of the developments is that tribes can play the same role that states do in operating their own regulatory programs. But the trick is you have to qualify and meet certain bureaucratic and other technical standards to be able to operate your own particular programs. And so you see tribes entering into, and this is not quite responding to your question, Remy, yet, but the first thing I want to mention is that, you know, under the cooperative federal system where tribes take on the role of states and manage certain programs, that one of the things that came out of that, where there were still many statutes where they were silent on tribes. And so one of the EJ issues that occurred was called regulatory gaps. So the RCRA Act, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, was one where it said that, and I'll forget this because I haven't talked about it in a while, but it said something like this. It said that states were responsible still for municipal solid waste, but the federal government was responsible for hazardous waste. And the statute was silent on tribes. And so what happened was on tribal reservations, the federal government took responsibility for hazardous waste. But because it didn't delegate to tribes the authority for municipal solid waste, and because it was delegated to states and states wouldn't mess in a tribal territory, there was no regulation for municipal solid waste on many reservations. And so in the 1990s, there was a study that found, actually, I think it was South Dakota was one of the, I forget what tribe, but it was actually the BIA office that was the one that was really dropping the ball. There were 6,000 open dumps on Indian reservations, which is a dump that is not healthy or safe. And who was taking responsibility for it? Well, the statute was silent. And so one of the environmental justice issues of the last few decades was how to actually get tribes in the position to be able to take responsibility over their own regulatory processes. Now, that program exists in terms of tribes running federal permitting programs. And yes, you do have some freedom, like you can set higher water air quality standards. And there's a well-known case where a pueblo downstream from Albuquerque, they found out that the city was sending discharge down that violated their higher water quality standards. And they took the city to administrative court and they won. But that's different. That's different from tribes actually creating their own code, their own permitting code. So an actual code where a tribal sovereign says, for anybody that wants to do X, Y, or Z nearby us or closer into the reservation area, that they need to show how they meet our standards and our understanding of what the risks are, our understanding of what safety means, and that our own code, our own permitting processes will be recognized by other authorities, by other sovereigns, in the same way that that works for other countries in their relationships with the United States. And so we're seeing some tribes begin to do this approach and realizing, well, wait a minute, if we're sovereigns, we can create our own code. We can create our own laws. And some of this work is, you know, there was, for example, a tribe, a First Nation in Canada called the Serpent River First Nation. And I know some tribes in the US do this as well. They created an entire survey system that if a company plugged in information, it would go into a model that they created that reflected their own worldview and set certain thresholds for what was too risky or not safe enough. And they actually made companies provide information that would feed into a holistic interpretation of environmental risk, including human health risks, cultural risks, risks to future generations, and other types of things. But then you also see some tribes at the council level adopting things like the rights of nature, the rights of rivers. The Ponca tribe did this, the Ho-Chunk tribe did this. I know in your part of the world, tribes have been thinking about issues like this as well. But I think for the coming generation, one of the big things that they're going to be pushing for, and I think this is something that we need to be pushing for, is this exact idea that tribes need to be actually understood as possessing that type of permitting authority and being able to determine the standards for permitting. Now, in terms of collaborations with states, and in South Dakota, I'd be curious to learn more about that relationship because, you know, the state of Michigan is actually engaged in compacts with tribes. There's a compact on climate change. And I don't mean like the gaming compacts, which are, you know, exploitative. You know, there's a compact on water. There's there's several other compacts, which are agreements, government to government agreements between the 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan and the state of Michigan. And I think the compacts, you know, they're only honored. It depends on the gubernatorial, administration, of course. But they are a basis for creating much more of a co-management situation, and one that's not just in terms of treaty rights, right? Because we do have co-management in terms of the major treaties within Michigan, and we have several organizations, one of which is the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, another which is the Chippewa-Ottawa Resource Authority, and they operate co-management jurisdiction over huge parts of the state with the state. But one of the things about those co-management arrangements is that they support tribes providing their own science. So the Chippewa-Ottawa Resource Authority, they have their own scientists. And if the state tries to point out that one of the 5 tribes in that authority is mismanaging its responsibilities, they can produce counter information. Or if they want to show that the state is not living up to, right, they can produce credible scientific information, but also credible traditional knowledge. And so I think the treaty organizations in the Great Lakes and the Pacific Northwest offer one example of where you see this idea of collaboration with states being much more meaningful. You know, a key example, there's an initiative called Treaty Rights at Risk, which is between the federally recognized tribes in the state of Washington and the state of Washington. And one of the things they found out is that even though the treaty protects their fishing rights with salmon, right, 50% based on the Bolt decision, that doesn't mean that the state can overdevelop the region and destroy the salmon habitat, right? And so they pointed out that even though the court decisions had established it's not just about the salmon, it's about the habitat, but still the state needs to monitor what it's doing, because if it's creating mega malls and vacation homes and areas that just rip apart the habitat for shellfish and salmon, that's problematic. And so they've created a much more detailed relationship between the federally recognized tribes and the state in that particular area, and one that I think is particularly instructive. But then in other parts of the US, and maybe this is the case in South Dakota, the state being responsive to that level of accountability is not typical. And so when I tell examples like this to people in other states, say, oh, you know, Wyoming would never do that, or whoever it was would never do that. But I think this is the direction we need to push in, and we need to actually show in local elections and state elections that there are important economic benefits and other benefits to these types of co-management relationships, and that there is an incentive for states to take this much more seriously.
Thank you. I mean, that says a lot. And I know that on the state level, there's been MOAs, MOUs, compacts, things like that states have attempted to do. In South Dakota in particular, it really seems like there's a hostile environment between state and tribal organizations. So getting them to getting both sides to the table to agree to put aside the other issues to agree on one issue is very difficult, especially since it's hard to approach our tribal nations in our state and saying we're here negotiating in good faith when there's 100 years of experience by the tribe saying otherwise. And also the other difficult part is when when there's regulatory gaps in jurisdiction, and tribes feel that treaties and in the past provide that the coverage in those gaps, and obviously state and federal government's not going to touch it until it goes to court. But states will take advantage of that. And a clear example is hunting and fishing. Every tribe across the United States has an issue with hunting and fishing, because just because they're within a physical boundary of where they're forced to live now doesn't mean they gave up their hunting and fishing rights over their traditional territory. And that's definitely the case in South Dakota, where the state is requiring hunting permits and fishing permits for the state, when the treaties clearly dictate that tribes have the ability to hunt in those areas that the state is claiming jurisdiction, and that's a regulatory gap. So I really like the idea of tribes being able to provide their own science. I think one of the things that the cases with Dakota Access Pipeline and KXL and things like that have borne fruit is that tribes should be giving our traditional knowledge and our science before it goes to litigation, and it needs to be taken seriously. And on that, being part of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, I've seen some of the stuff that's done, and how convenient it is for a state historic preservation officer, for example, to go and document all the homesteads or the pioneer family's traditional home sites in an area, and totally negate the fact that Native Americans or members of our tribe even lived there in the past, and overlook tribal historic preservation. And you're right, that is one of the places where my tribe in particular has utilized the Indian Self-Determination Act is in that tribal historic preservation area. But I think it should reach outside of reservation boundaries, that tribes should have the ability to regulate a territory that they still have by treaty. And I think that's a really important aspect that's missing in environmental justice. Is the Black Hills are sacred. They're ours by treaty. Supreme Court said that they didn't belong to the United States. Why aren't tribes exercising permitting authority over that same area? And a lot of this stuff can avoid a lot of conflict too. And you're right, it can definitely be productive. So Elena, you had a question?
I do, kind of a comment going back to the state and tribal relations. I don't know if you're familiar, Dr. Whyte, about the really GOP supermajority legislature that we have here in the state. We are severely outnumbered as Democrats. I believe we have 11 Democrats in our legislature, and it's been really tough these past couple of years. Trying to get stuff passed has been almost impossible. And it's interesting because 2 years ago, I believe it was 2 years ago, the Republicans passed a ban to ban future bans of single-use plastic in the future. And the arguments were outrageous. One of I believe it was the prime sponsor said, why is it bad that a plastic cup sinks to the bottom? That's housing for fish. And we find ourselves as Democrats are just we're having to try to counter these extreme opinions and views, and it's frustrating. And more recently, our governor combined two agencies into one agency and got rid of the environment aspect. So the environment regulation or regulatory authority, now we don't know what's going to happen. And a report just came out recently that the state is failing. They're only doing 5%. They're only within 5% of compliance with water issues in the state. EPA regulations were failing over 95% of those regulations and mandates. So I'm really glad that you're on. I want to know if we can use, I'm looking at your articles. I love what you're saying. I think it's impactful. Is it okay if I take your research and use it in our messaging when we're talking about environmental justice and environmental injustice, and use it in our fights here locally?
Yeah, absolutely. And good to you know, have the opportunity to be supportive of the work that you are all doing. I mean, I appreciate your sharing the, the struggles, Elena, and yeah, any of the work I've provided, is public work for you to use and cite as it is supportive. And, I've got other things too. And especially, some of the recent policy work I've been part of, and I'm going to connect to Elena what I was going to respond to you to some of the things that that Remy had just mentioned, is that this recent work we're doing at the White House is very, very relevant. So for example, in the 90-page recommendations I sent you, one of the things that we worked on, so our White House Council is separated into 3 work groups. One work group is on Justice 40, which is the infrastructure issue. And so on the infrastructure issue, that's huge because in situations where the state is not being respectful of environmental issues, right? Because the infrastructure investment is not just about capacity building, it's about other people doing infrastructure nearby you as well. And so that's going to create a very stressful situation. And in states where they've rolled back all of their regulatory measures like you're describing, you'll see in the recommendations that we hit very hard that the Biden administration, and I've been also doing this, though I'm less involved in it, but trying to do this at the legislative level too, that they really need to be very clear about what environmental equity looks like when the infrastructure spending is rolling out, especially where states are not accountable. And so a second work group, so in that Justice 40 work group, there is a discussion about this issue with states. And the council I'm on is 26 people. There's a couple of folks that are younger, but the majority of people on the committee are folks that have worked on this for decades. And, in states like Texas and, California, all of them have the same message. What they've learned is while there are opportunities at the federal level, the biggest thorns in their side are municipalities and states. And for the reasons you mentioned, Elena. And so we've been pushing very hard to get the federal government to understand that, yes, we understand that the federal powers do not extend over states and dominate and control states, but there has to be a better way. There still has to be a better way. And so we did our best to build in as much as possible to cover the issue with states. A second work group is on Executive Order 12898. That was an executive order from 1994, which was the first executive order to name environmental justice. And one of the things that I wanted to mention is that executive order is actually fairly silent about the fact that agencies have a responsibility to both consultation, and the old executive order references consultation, but primarily with DOI. It's also fairly silent with respect to civil rights, Title VI. And so in our revisions to the executive order, we are very clear that this is about Title VI, this is about consultation, and this is about meaningful involvement, which means capacity to influence decision-making. And we have a lot of different statements about what this means for the relationships with states. And the federal government can't be putting communities in situations where they can just be taken advantage of by states. And the other side of this, that's more to what Remy was asking about, is actually one of the big things that we called for in our recommendations was to actually point out that while it's true that there's federal funding that supports tribal environmental departments, that the federal funding is, and tribal historic preservation offices, the funding is not going to tribes in a way where those tribes can spend it so as to focus on where the environmental justice issues are and where the sacred and significant places are. And what we've been trying to push, and I think this is an important thing at the national level, is that actually, and this speaks to a third working group in it as well, but we need to get people to understand without trespassing over privacy or private information, secret tribal information, but that the tribal land bases, as you describe, Remy, and again, this is significant for Elena's question about states trampling over the land base, is that we need to be able to get folks to understand that it's not just about the reservation. And there needs to be adequate funding and support for the TIPOs, for the environmental departments, so they can have the right focus. Because with the new infrastructure spending, the TIPO offices will be overwhelmed. They're already overwhelmed. They're going to be further overwhelmed. I've been in a number of visited tribes that were facing EJ issues where the only person that was delegated to provide counter evidence on an EJ issue occurring off reservation was the TIPO officer, as if that person has time. So I've walked into TIPO offices, they have stacks of books, papers everywhere, because they're trying to scramble to figure this out. So one of the things we're trying to work on is that the federal investments need to be focused on empowering tribes to be able to manage and take care of the lands that they choose to matter to them, which often include the off-reservation areas. And so, Elena, in terms of dealing with the hostility of states, I think right now the question of infrastructure and the banner of infrastructure the Democratic Party is taking up, it's actually forcing everybody else, not Native people, been working on this for a while, but it's forcing everybody else to now focus on these issues which previously were relegated to implementation, but that actually these are the issues, that you can't successfully have infrastructure spending if the state is so toxic that none of the projects will come to fruition because they'll fail at the level of state tribal relations or county tribal relations. And so one of the messages I did want to convey to you all in terms of your work and what we're doing at the White House is that we're entering into a time where I think we can focus on these issues as critical issues, because if we can't make progress on them, then the big Democratic initiatives are not going to have a local impact. And from a Democratic Party perspective, that's not going to generate the energy to win another election, especially given the forces that we're going to have to reckon with starting soon and then in 3 years.
Right. I mean, you make a really valid point on all of that. And I could even point out, you're right. Our TIPOs are drinking water through a fire hose with all the stuff that's coming at them, not just from different federal agencies or the corporations or the private individuals, but also the multitude of litigation issues that tribes have to go to that require TIPO input. And I can name the lawsuit that we have with Governor Nome right now over the fireworks at Mount Rushmore, and that one of our central arguments is our TIPO. But one of the things that I think is disconcerting for tribes is our only argument really religious freedom or historical? What about why isn't all of these the other inequities that you've discussed so far this evening addressed in those consultation processes? I think that's the key takeaway from here too, is to understand the impact of a decision on the people, because a lot of our people don't live on reservations. A lot of our people live in the Black Hills, and the impact on them, not just religiously, but psychologically, and then we're not even talking about our tribal members, but our allies or our neighbors, our friends that live amongst us. All of those things are important, I think. And I think when we start thinking on that level at the state, and pushing for those changes, then we can get a lot more accomplished. And so we've spent a lot of time here tonight talking about it, and I think this is a new record for us. This is the longest we've gone so far ever on an evening speaker, and we haven't given you many breaks here. But I, honestly, I could talk about these issues probably all into the night. So if you're ever in South Dakota, please look me up and reserve a night where we can get together and have a good discussion. I love everything you've got to say, and I would love to give you our tribal perspective here in South Dakota, but I'm not gonna hog it all. Barring any last questions, anybody?
Ramey,
Yes, sir.
this is Dennis. I just want to thank you for this interesting program. We all have lots of meetings and stuff that we attend via Zoom and starting in person. I will tell you, this will go down as one of the most interesting and informative meetings that I've attended the last few months. So thank you very much to Dr. Whyte, to Ramey and Alina. Also, I know you said you recorded it. I did have two people that they weren't able to be on the call tonight because their club or their organization was being to elect officers. Will you be posting this on Facebook that we could share, or how can we access this recording? Again, thank you. Well done.
Thank you. I can answer that really quick. We do have a YouTube channel that Sydney is going to be uploading all of our past Oceti Sakowin Caucus weekly series like this. So I will send out an email once it's posted, and then so everybody can view it. So thanks, Dennis. I'm sorry, Dr. Whyte, go ahead.
Yeah, and those links, Elena, if you need me to follow up with any PDFs or other documents for some of the links or other things, let me know. But if I have a second, I'll maybe send you some of those documents. Because, a lot of the points that you're bringing up, and I know we're coming to a close, but I just want to say, a lot of the points you're bringing up are you're not alone. And some of the current policy work being done is, I wouldn't say that it's saying it as well as some of you are sharing it, but basically, I'd like for you to see some of what's going on that you're not already aware of. So I do want to try to do more stuff to send you. And likewise, if you all are in our neck of the woods, do let me know. And while I don't know how this has occurred or whatever it is, it would be great to connect with the Anishinaabe Caucus as well, if there hasn't already been such a connection made at some of the national meetings that maybe some of you have gone to and maybe connected with some of our folks.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Speaking from a Oceti Sakowin Caucus perspective, I think it'd be a wonderful idea for some of our leadership to reach out to each other and have a dialogue for things on a national level in the party. So that's a great invitation. We'd love to take you up on that. Again, thank you everybody for being here this evening. This has been such a wonderful discussion, especially on my part. I didn't want it to end. So, I hesitate to bid everybody adieu, but Dr. Whyte, we generally ask our speakers to give the final thoughts before we leave. And is there a message that you would like to convey to both our viewers now and our viewers who are going to view this at a future time?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really inspired by the fact that, our different caucuses, our native caucuses within, political parties that for Native people, it's about expressing our views, raising our voices, and creating empowerment. And I always get encouraged to, when I connect with some of these incredible political groups that are out there, and you all are amazing, that we're self-determining and we're not taking any party line. We're we're taking steps that are meaningful to our people and our communities, and we're working with the current political system and with certain political parties in ways that can make change, but that it's us doing the self-determining.
Well, thank you very much for coming here tonight. I know asking you to come all the way to South Dakota via Zoom. On a final note, I love your shirt. Water is life.
Oh, thank you.
Mini Wachoni, as we say here in Dakota territory. And I'd like to end on that note. Water is life. And everybody, thank you for joining us. And
Thank you. And if
oh,
you could post the YouTube channel, I've learned so much. I have nothing to say except that I'm a sponge. I love the fact that there's inter-nation dialogue going on. I think that really is great. Between all, it's like there's such wisdom that can be learned through each other. And, I just, anyway, I'm going to keep listening to everything you do. I think it's very important dialogue and education for everybody. So thank you, everybody. This has been a very wonderful night.
thank you, Victoria. And I guess on that note, I'll close by saying I think this is a good opportunity to remind everybody that the laws of man do not trump the laws of nature. And our what we do should be in support of our fellow man and our planet. So thank you, Dr. Whyte, for being here tonight. I hope to listen to you again soon.
Hey, great. I hope to connect with you all too. Take care.
Doksha, okay.
Bye-bye.